Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're untangling the incredibly complex, decades-long boomerang of cause and effect between the US and Iran. This really isn't just about the latest headlines. We're looking at a deeply rooted story of energy, economics, and sheer regime survival that's basically been compounding for the better part of a century. Okay, so to really grasp the sheer asymmetry of where this conflict is at today, just consider this stark contrast for a second. On one side, you've got cheap Iranian Shahed drones, costing maybe $20,000 a pop. On the other side, those exact same drones are routinely flying into and completely destroying U.S. radars, like the AN/TPY-2, which are worth an estimated $300 million. Let that sink in. It's a staggering financial and tactical imbalance, and it perfectly illustrates how the very nature of this conflict has evolved. So, to figure out how we arrived at these astronomically high stakes, we need to trace this global chess match through 5 key phases: the battle for oil, the petrodollar power play, revolution and retaliation, the nuclear chess match, and finally, the asymmetric war we're seeing today. All right, let's jump straight into phase 1, the battle for oil. Let's rewind all the way back to the 1950s. At this point in history, Iran was an absolute energy juggernaut. We're talking about them supplying an astonishing 16% of the West's crude oil and 67% of its bunker fuel. But here's the catch. The vast majority of that wealth was flowing right out of the country to Britain. So in 1951, Iranian Prime Minister Mossadegh steps up and decides to nationalize the oil, aiming to keep those profits for his own people. Well, fearing a loss of control and, of course, creeping Soviet influence, the CIA and MI6 step in. In 1953, they orchestrate Operation Ajax, effectively removing Mossadegh and installing the Shah, making Iran a fiercely US-aligned state. Now, get ready for a serious dose of historical irony. To fortify the Shah as a reliable buffer against the Soviets, the U.S. actually initiated the Atoms for Peace program in 1957. They literally handed over entire nuclear ecosystems, research centers, and the foundational knowledge to Iran. Fast forward to today, and the U.S. is spending billions of dollars dropping bombs trying to destroy the exact same nuclear foundation they freely gave away decades ago. Which leads us perfectly into phase 2, the petrodollar power play. This is where the global economy gets a massive, fundamental restructuring. The crucial turning point here hits in 1971 with the Nixon shock. That's when the US dollar officially detached from the gold standard. So without gold backing it up, the US desperately needed a new anchor to maintain global trust and, more importantly, global demand for its currency. The solution? Petrodollar recycling. The logic was simple. Oil is a universal necessity, right? So if you tie global oil sales strictly to the US dollar, you practically guarantee the dollar's dominance forever. And here is exactly how they pull that off. In 1974, the US struck a huge master deal with Saudi Arabia. Step 1, the US legally guarantees the military security of the Saudi royal family. Step 2, in exchange, Saudi Arabia ensures that OPEC sells its oil exclusively in US dollars. Step 3, those massive influxes of excess dollars are then heavily reinvested right back into U.S. Treasury bonds. In one fell swoop, global oil demand became permanent U.S. dollar demand. And ironically, that system essentially funded the very U.S. military that was policing the Middle East to protect it. So this carefully constructed U.S. hegemony seemed pretty much invincible. But it was about to face a catastrophic shock in phase 3, revolution and retaliation. Right at the tail end of the 1970s, the U.S.'s most trusted regional ally flipped almost overnight. Ayatollah Khomeini led the 1979 Islamic Revolution, entirely ousting the U.S.-backed Shah and eventually seizing the American embassy. And right on the heels of that chaos, the brutal Iran-Iraq War kicks off in 1980. During that decade, Iraq repeatedly used chemical weapons against Iranian civilians. Iran goes to the UN to protest, and what do they get? Total international silence. That was a defining, absolute wake-up call for Iran. It taught them, point blank, that the world was not coming to save them. If they wanted to survive, they were completely on their own. Realizing they simply couldn't fight the US or its allies in a conventional head-to-head war, Iran heavily pivoted. They constructed what they call a forward defense strategy, creating this axis of resistance. So instead of direct conflict, Iran starts funding, arming, and training proxy groups all over the region. We're talking Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis. By tapping into existing anti-US and anti-Israel sentiments, Iran figured out how to project serious power far beyond its own borders, all without risking a devastating invasion of their homeland. And that brings us to Phase 4, the nuclear chess match. This is where things escalate from regional proxy skirmishes to literal existential threats. Think about it from Iran's perspective. They just watched the U.S. effortlessly overthrow Saddam Hussein in neighboring Iraq. They quickly concluded that the only thing that could truly guarantee their regime's survival was ultimate deterrence. So they revived that dormant nuclear program. And to understand this, you have to understand uranium enrichment. Natural uranium has less than 1% of the U-235 isotope. If you enrich it to roughly 3 to 5%, great, you can power a civilian city. But if you push that enrichment all the way up to 90%, you now have the core material for a nuclear weapon. What followed was just a wildly volatile tug-of-war. In 2015, you have the JCPOA agreement, capping Iran's enrichment at a safe 3.67% in exchange for lifting crushing economic sanctions. But then, 3 years later, the U.S. officially pulls out of the deal. Tensions absolutely skyrocket. Fast forward to 2021, and the Natanz nuclear facility is attacked, widely attributed to Israel, destroying a bunch of advanced centrifuges. But Iran doesn't fire a missile back. Instead, their retaliation is purely mathematical. They dramatically spike their uranium enrichment right up to 60%, pushing dangerously close to that weapons-grade threshold. From there, the timeline accelerates at breakneck speed. In June of 2025, after a really tense standoff, the U.S. launches Operation Midnight Hammer. Massive B-2 stealth bombers heavily strike Iranian nuclear sites. The U.S. initially claimed a major victory, but later satellite tracking revealed a totally different reality. Just days before the strike, fleets of trucks had successfully moved and hidden over 200 kilograms of that 60% enriched uranium, burying it deep underground. So while the strikes delayed the program, they entirely failed to eliminate it. The total failure of those deep penetration strikes brings us to the absolute boiling point of early 2026. Our final phase, the asymmetric war. So in February 2026, there was actually a brief moment of optimism. Peace talks over in Oman were showing really positive signals. But then, on February 28th, the U.S. abruptly shifts gears and launches Operation Epic Fury. Using highly precise intel, they bomb a meeting in Tehran and successfully assassinate Iran's top leadership. The U.S. calculation was pretty straightforward. Cut the head off the snake, and the regime will finally collapse. But literally the very next day, the exact opposite happened. Now, the reason the regime didn't just fold is fascinating. Iran had spent years preparing for this exact decapitation scenario by building what they call the Mosaic Doctrine. They literally divided the entire country into 31 provincial commands. Each one had a decentralized leader with totally independent operational control. So when the central leadership was wiped out, those 31 commanders instantly activated. They launched a devastating, entirely headless counterattack across the Gulf. There wasn't even a single central leader left for the U.S. to negotiate a ceasefire with. The initial strategy completely backfired. Plus, you have to factor in that Iran is uniquely built to take a hit. They have this massive geographic shield. The country is bordered by the Zagros and Alborz mountain ranges, which basically act as nature's fortresses. And beneath those mountains, Iran has spent decades hollowing them out to build massive underground missile and drone cities. Furthermore, just look at their vast landmass. They can absorb thousands of conventional bombs with way less critical damage to their infrastructure, especially when you compare them to smaller, incredibly dense neighbors where a single missile can disrupt multiple cities at once. But here's the thing. Iran's ultimate leverage isn't buried deep underground. It's right out there on the water, specifically the Strait of Hormuz. This is a tiny navigable choke point that is just 9 kilometers wide. 20% of the entire global oil supply has to flow right past Iran's coastline here. That includes 50% of India's energy and 40% of China's. Iran doesn't need a massive navy to sink every ship. Striking just one commercial vessel freezes the entire strait the second international insurance companies pull their coverage. By blocking this single waterway, Iran can directly crash the exact same petrodollar system the U.S. has spent the last 50 years fiercely protecting. And it goes so much deeper than just oil. As part of this asymmetric retaliation, Iran's incredibly cheap mountain-launched drones critically threaten the Gulf's modern lifeblood. You see, the U.S.-backed Gulf states rely on massive, highly exposed desalination plants for a staggering 60% of their daily drinking water. On top of that, running right along the floor of the Gulf and the Red Sea are the fragile submarine cables that literally hold the global internet and international banking systems together. Iran has the localized, cheap power to sever these vital lifelines for a tiny fraction of what it costs the U.S. to try and defend them. So as we watch this multi-decade boomerang of regime changes, nuclear sabotage, and nonstop proxy wars escalate right before our eyes, it really all funnels down to this single, chilling reality. When cheap drones and completely decentralized command structures can threaten the global banking system, paralyze world energy flows, and potentially target the basic drinking water of entire nations, we really have to ask ourselves, just how unbelievably fragile is the unseen infrastructure holding our modern world together? Thank you for exploring this explainer with me today. Let that question sit with you until next time.